welcome to Aimless Ramblings. I'm here with Tim and Simon, and today's topic, in a broad sense, we figured, hey, could you not do pandemic? So, gonna jump off with Tim first, and then I think followed by Simon, then I'll wrap it up at the end. Tim, take her away.
Thank you very much, Sam. So what I was going to start off with, I suppose, is something not particularly sciencey. As Sam has mentioned, I am more of the arts type. But I was going to look at pandemic through the idea of fear and fear as pandemic. So I suppose when we're talking about ideas and ideology, one productive way that we can look at them, particularly when we're talking about ideas in counterterrorism theory and political theory, is that ideas very much propagate in a similar method as normal viral diseases. So it's all about exposure and vector. So if you have a society, and a great example is Afghanistan, I suppose, right up until the 19th century, you have a very low level of education, which makes it very difficult for ideas such as Marxism or nationalism or liberalism to take hold because people aren't really exposed to these ideas on a day-to-day basis, and because the economic subsistence nature of their living means that those ideas don't really have a huge amount of exposure in their day-to-day lives. Therefore, when you do have some economic growth, and particularly input of education into that system, these ideas, they now become vulnerable to these ideas, I suppose, and they become exposed to these ideas, which then have flow-on political consequences. In the case of Afghanistan, we saw the collapse of the monarchy and the rise of the PDPA, which was a communist regime, and the so on and so forth, violence and death that occurred in the Afghan-Soviet wars. Now, that's an ideological sort of example, but I think something that we are experiencing and have seen, one of the most significant aspects of the current COVID-19 outbreak, as opposed to individual infection and disease, has been the actual fear that is engendered in particularly a lot of Western populations. And this has resulted in pretty classic pandemic and plague-like behavior, things like hoarding, things like people going into sort of prepper mode, going and locking themselves away, part of which is actually in line with the quarantine requirements. And part of that is sort of out of a fear of not just the actual effects of the disease, but the effects of a potential collapse on society. And, these kinds of things are replicated in other societies, and not just around disease. Like, for instance, you could argue that pandemics of fear in places like Papua New Guinea lead to saucer killings. Or in Malaysia, I know, for instance, fear of existence of hantu or ghosts/demons in particularly remote regional schools has actually led to widespread hysteria and the closing of schools and people having to bring in witch doctors or imams to actually exercise the school before people are willing to send their kids back there. So one of the things I wanted to ask is, one, do you think that the use of pandemic and the idea of virology and applying it to how fear and ideology spread in a social context is a productive model? And two, if so, how do you think we can inoculate a population against these things, noting that, as I've said, in some cases, by using education, you can actually increase the rate of exposure for a population. And two, in a modern situation where there is a lot of distrust in governments and in media, where people often will turn to other sources that may be pretty damaging with regards to fake news or whatever you want to call it, or bad information. And I think Sam has something to say to start off.
Yeah, so because I can't help but be a literalist, and I apologize, I probably wouldn't call it a pandemic, because that, pan, everyone, and demos mean people, so, or all people. So a pandemic requires, global spread. Otherwise, it's just an epidemic. But yeah, that's just me being a nerd. I definitely think, though, inoculation as such could be quite useful in this. So, if people are aware of the concepts that it could happen to them, they'll be more prepared mentally to deal with it. You know what I mean? So, like, if people had effective disaster management plans, and they rehearse these as soon as a disaster takes place. They just kick into their disaster management plan instead of this frantic, oh my God, 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 you know? And I can totally understand the contagion side of it, you know? I've got, I think, 5 rolls of toilet paper, right? I haven't seen any in the shops for 2 and a bit weeks. So I can understand the fear not to be left behind, or the go, I don't want to panic buy, but if I don't, I'm going to have nothing. So that's the kind of contagion side of it.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on 2 pretty important things there. Firstly, my wife is an emergency management, disaster management specialist. She did a master's in it. One of the things that she talks about often is this idea of community resilience. And so what you need to do prior to a disaster actually hitting is you need to actually make sure that the community is capable of taking the emotional and the psychological strain and burden of a disaster scenario, because often that's the kind of thing that leads to the breakdown of a society and a community post disaster, as opposed to the actual initial shock of the event. And things such as looting, intracommunal violence, it can really come out of those pre-existing fractures that exist in society. Now, the other issue that you touched on there when you were talking about the toilet rolls and wanting to, everyone wanted to go out and panic buy, I think really sort of touches on that idea of the tragedy of the commons. So in some ways, I suppose, if people don't see themselves as part of a community, and if they're not really being inculcated into the idea that other people's lives and needs matter as much as their own, then really there can be that sort of desire to go out and just seize whatever you can and protect yourself at the expense of others. And I suppose it's that constant tension between individual and group needs, which really comes out to the fore in an epidemic or a pandemic scenario. Simon, you have something to say?
Yeah, my major takeaway was originally I was like, okay, cool. So people are panic buying, but what I found is people are trying to use it as a supply demand sort of thing. So there's a bunch of people who are using eBay and whatnot to sell their excess toilet paper, excess thing. So it's less of a, oh wow, I really need all this, and it's more that people will want this. So there's this sort of capitalist concept that I've seen that's really popular across a lot of areas where people are like, oh wow, this is my point to get on the bandwagon and make shitloads of money, which, I don't know, is that just a general individualist culture kind of thing as you were discussing, or is that anyway, Sam, you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I think you could be I don't know about the numbers. I don't imagine there's actually probably a large percentage of people doing this, but the people doing it would definitely be exacerbating it. I remember reading about some Yank that bought $10,000 worth of hand sanitizer. That's a shit ton of hand sanitizer. And I wondered if you're right, yeah, and it's just this overexpression, to stick with, genetics or virological terms, overexpression of the capitalistic individualism, which, we have been, since the 80s, been raised on that. Hell, the motto of the 80s was greed is good. So maybe we need to reconsider that.
Definitely. I do think, though, potentially as well, that in any given society, there's going to be a breadth of different expressions of social behavior. And I don't know, I suppose this would be interesting to look from a sociobiological perspective. But how much of that expression of individualism and group solidarity is maybe something that is acculturated in an individual, as opposed to the old nature versus nurture argument, like how maybe humans and cultures survive from a socio-evolutionary perspective because you need to have a good balance of both individual and group-driven peoples within that culture, which allows it to be more productive in some regards. Individuals pursuing their own ends can be a good method of spurring economic and innovative growth, while at the same time you also need to have enough people who are willing to play the game. At the same time, potentially people who are purely individualistic are actually parasitic, and it's the same sort of thing as psychopaths, although Simon's sure going to smack me down in a second for using that term, where you've got people who have very low or very basically negligible ability to empathize, and they sort of live almost in a parasitic nature with the society in which they exist. Well, I think I've sort of yarned on enough, but I think Simon has a little bit more to talk with regards to epidemics and pandemics from a slightly different perspective. So I'll throw over to him.
Okay, so I'm going to preface this with might give Sam specifically NARM flashbacks, because there's a tale as old as social media, which is science versus social media. And my specific thing is misinformation. And unfortunately, because of my lack of connection to a lot of my resources I used to have at university, I've had to only be able to use the blurb from a lot of these ones. So it might, counterproductively later on. But there was a couple of interesting ones. The one that was about the Zika virus in 2017 discussed specifically Facebook, which is, with recent numbers, there's actually been a lot of older generation are using it, but there's still the tail end of the younger generation who aren't moved across to, the Snapchatters and the whatever. But yeah, it was just found that the popularity, and obviously a lot of these Facebook things work on popularity, work on like how many likes and whatnot gets. The more like misinformed it is, the more likely they're like to see it. And the reason they give is because it gives more of a straight answer. Whereas science is like, oh, well, in this case, you'll probably have to do this. In this case, you'll have to do this. It's like, okay, in all cases, do this. And that's what a lot of people are like sort of cling to in times of worry. They just want answers. And a lot of these misleading posts give answers that are easy to understand and that are very straightforward. Again, there was another one that was done in, this one is 2015, so this is a bit earlier. They actually did a full study about, again, Facebook. It seems to be their favorite one to use as social. Obviously, it can vary from one to the other, but Facebook is usually used as the baseline for social media interaction. And what was found is that their argument is that what should happen is that public health should try and employ similar tactics, which I don't know if that's really going to work. But, there's been a lot of police outreach. There's been a lot of whatnot that's used sort of the, inverted commas, social media jargon in a way to actually interact with the community and actually get proper response. Some notable relations are the New South Wales and the Queensland Police Service. They seem to utilize social media marketing to sort of the best effect. I'll also be sending all the ones. So if you want to read this, it should be below the video if you want to actually look a bit further in. And then one was released pretty much 4 days ago. And it's discussing the exact same thing. And it's, talking about how there's this solidarity, there's similarities about apparently this has been continuing on since, the HIV epidemic, AIDS epidemic. It's just they want something to blame. There's multiple theories about this. I'm not going to read through it, but yeah. It's Sam, you ever want to say something?
Yeah, on the topic of misinformation, in a crisis, it's interesting that even the ivory tower of science isn't safe. I've been noticing a lot of studies being published in actual journals lately that have essentially taken the 80,000 odd cases in China and then cherry picked data until they can have something they say. So you've got 80,000 people, but they're actually just using a subset of, say, 150 from one rural hospital, instead of looking at these trends across the broader thing. So, it might be if you took XY medication, you will have an 80% chance of dying, and then that gets published. But if you actually look at across the broader population, it doesn't exist anymore. It's just this tiny subset had that. And so it seems to be there's actually a lot of... I apologize for throwing shade to anyone doing research on coronavirus at the moment, because you are entirely possibly doing genuinely real and meaningful research, but essentially taking hold of this fear in order to publish what truthfully is not probably valid science. So it looks like, it's not just social media that's responsible for this fake news type shit. Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I suppose from two perspectives. Firstly, there's definitely obviously that publish and perish mentality, both in academia and in media more broadly. So it's all about, getting the actual the likes or the references or whatever to make sure that you have some sort of impact score against which as a key performance indicator you can be measured against for your own purposes, whether that be advertising or otherwise. Simon, you got something to say before I cut something else?
Yeah, pretty much my takeaway from, as Sam was discussing, science doing the same sort of things. And I feel like it's not really put enough pressure on, but that science also is held by not only the publish or perish kind of concept, that they have to stay current, or a lot of times the funding sort of disappears because a lot of funding for a lot of these major health things come directly from the government. So the government might have been interested in, alternative things for muscular scoliosis, but that might not particularly be in, like, obviously people who, yeah, okay, I'll just ramble off. So anyway, yeah, Tim, you have something?
Yeah, no, so I definitely think you're right in the sense that some things elevate at different times. So there's like flavors of what's important at any one time. So you have to remain relevant, you need to publish constantly on whatever the latest craze in medicine or the media is. Another thing I was going to say, this is interesting from a fake news perspective, if you want to use the term, is that when you're talking about coronavirus in a geopolitical context, it's amazing the amount of conspiracy theories and the different language that is being used concerning COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, whatever you want to call it, basically with regards to, one, the amount of time it took for the World Health Organization to declare it a pandemic and accusations that was because of Chinese pressure, but also, the way that President Trump has particularly depicted the virus and his reaction to it, things such as, calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. And finally, also the way in which the CCP in China has very much so, although it's not actively claiming certain things, it is pushing and it is highlighting certain conspiracy theories that claim, that the CIA developed the virus, or that the virus didn't come from China, that's actually an American virus, and that it's now being blamed on China. And so it's interesting, I suppose, that we've talked about how governments want to counter fake news or want to counter false information and misinformation in the media domain so that they can make sure that they're the correct message with regards to immunization, good quarantine, and good anti-pandemic practices are going to place. But at the same time, I suppose for some actors, it's more important that they, progress their geopolitical, goals at the same time. And two of the major actors that are doing that right now are China and America. Do you guys have anything you want to say on that?
So, yeah, and I mean, look at Russia. I think the cases of pneumonia in Moscow were something like 300 to 400% higher than this time last year, but they have virtually no cases. Interesting. And also SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. COVID-19 is the disease caused by the virus, if you want to be technical, sorry. But yeah, it's, geopolitics is normal, If you just look at the political language used even in Australia, say, at no point did we have ministers come out and say, actually, we don't have enough tests to be testing everyone at the moment. But you have, a hospital in Sydney that 3 times in one day increases the criteria required to get tested. Because understandably why? Because they don't want to generate panic. But it's still a degree of misinformation being put out. But hey, geopolitics, right?
Yeah, and I suppose in some ways, secrecy and deception are tools of politics, which can be used for, good and evil are pretty relative in my personal perspective, but to achieve the aims that you want. So deception, for instance, for warfare is a pretty important thing in terms of making sure that your own forces aren't destroyed. And one could argue, as long as you're on the quote-unquote right side, that deception is pretty necessary. I think, though, we should probably throw to yourself, Sam, noting that we've kind of, I want to use the term pussyfooted, but I'm not sure if that's quite was it politically correct these days, around the topic of pandemic without really stepping into the science of it. And I think you've got something you want to talk about from a more scientific perspective.
Yeah, to a degree, though I got to admit, like reading through this, I'm like, oh Jesus Christ, it's been so long since I've done this. Like there was ORF was an acronym used frequently, and I was like, I mean, I know ORF stands for Open Reading Frame, but I don't actually remember what that means anymore. So I think I need to go back and do a lot more genetics, because I'm starting to forget it all. But broadly, what I was going to talk about is GB virus C, essentially. Reasonably old virus. I think, when was it discovered? A while back, anyway. Yeah. 60s, maybe? Yeah, 60s. Initially, they thought it was a form of hepatitis. But whilst it's from that family, or genus, sorry, the Pegivirus family. Genus, fuck me. The Pegivirus genus. It doesn't actually seem to cause any pathology in people. So, at any given time, something like 20% of the planet is infected with this virus, but it doesn't do anything. So, there's this global pandemic with 1 billion people infected, but nothing. So, viruses aren't anything new. Something like 8% at the top end of our genome is actually viral DNA. Be that from, back when we were monkeys or even earlier, who knows? But, viruses aren't new. They're fucking gorgeous things, Anyone that does any virology will really quickly learn how beautiful a virus is, It's essentially taken the fundamentals of life and stripped it back to the bare basics. Some people would say it's not even alive, but that's just, pedantics. But an interesting thing about this GB virus C, right? So if your cells are infected with this virus, and then say you contract HIV, or you already have HIV, and then you contract GB virus C, the viruses actually compete with each other because they want to be infecting the same cell groups. And so, what's the correct term? So HIV is actually quite a cytopathic virus. So it essentially destroys the cells to spread further. And so is, to a degree, but not as much, GB virus C. And since they target the same cells, an infection with GB virus C actually drops the number of CD4 positive T cells, which HIV could target. And additionally, when the GB virus infects these cells, it actually down-regulates the expression of the surface proteins that HIV would bind to. So it makes your cells less susceptible to infection. So we often think of viruses as, these mindless automatons, which they effectively are. But even they aren't free from the evolutionary pressure to compete, which is just super interesting. Thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say that is absolutely fascinating. So is this a relatively regular or common thing in the viral world? I suppose one thing I would note is that it's interesting that those diseases that do have very pathological expressions, for instance, things like Ebola, which, because of the nature and the destructiveness of the disease, actually in some ways hampers the spread of the virus that causes it. Is this a common thing where you have a very destructive disease in terms of for the host, which is then competing with the other diseases that have a relatively low level thing? And I think Simon has something else to add.
What I found really interesting, as Tim was discussing, is this a common thing? And because of variation within the species, there's a lot of cases where if a cancer gets large enough, some cancer cells will try and become a cancer in and of itself, and in process, because they are both after blood nutrients and whatnot to survive, they will kill each other off. So there'll be cancers on cancers that will kill the cancer, which I found quite interesting. Not as interesting as your viral example, but yeah, I just wanted to chuck that out there, which I thought was pretty cool. That I think it was in a discussion about how larger animals don't seem to get cancer, but the thing is that they do get cancer. It's just that they don't notice because it's such a small percentage of their whole blood flow that their body can just compensate for it. But anyway, yeah, hand off to Sam.
Yeah. So for a virus to compete with another virus, Tim, they tend to have to infect the same cells. There are some examples where they can modulate immune responses. So say you're infected with virus A, it may increase the proliferation of your immune cells, which will then assist in shrugging off another infection. But that's not necessarily intentional. It's just a byproduct of our body trying to kill it off. But if they compete for the same cell, it's really common that, or the same type of cells, really common that they'll attempt to prevent other viruses, even themselves. Like HIV, for instance, also downregulates the proteins it binds to in the T cells because it doesn't want multiple copies infecting the same cell. And we're going to anthropomorphize the shit out of viruses, and I apologize because that's how we understand them. It doesn't want multiple copies in the one cell because it's not more efficient than one copy in multiple cells or whatever, Simon, I forgot what your question was, so sorry. But Tim, you had something?
Yeah, I'll throw back to Simon to restate his question for you in a sec. But I was going to ask, is it kind of in that way, like kind of sense, if you have multiple viruses competing for the same resource in the human body, you end up with sort of like a cybernetic system, like an ecology, where eventually you'll reach a steady state? Or is it that kind of like a wrong analogy because the body is also in itself trying to fight and kill these viruses?
So broadly speaking, if you don't kill the virus, for most viruses they will kill you because that's the nature of the beast. They are cellularly destructive. So you don't really ever reach a stasis, and it tends to be if it's what are they called? Jesus Christ, the ones that put themselves into your own DNA. With Jesus Christ, all my university lecturers are rolling in their graves.
Retrovirus.
Anyway, thank you. If it's a retrovirus, it could go dormant, and so then your immune system might be able to shrug off the competing virus, and then the retrovirus reemerges. But if it's not a retrovirus, it will probably just be the less competitive virus. Essentially, will be the first eliminated, and then in theory, your immune system will eventually, if you don't die, eliminate the other one. What was your question, Simon?
God, I can't even remember. It was something about larger animals and the fact that, like, some bodies, because they are so large, they can actually just shrug off a lot of these things. So they might be damaging to, like, the human body, but the human body is just so large that it just goes, oh, well, I'll just leave it sitting over there and it'll kill itself off. But it really doesn't. It just sits there. But yeah, that's about it.
Oh yeah, cancer, that's right. It's actually like a really good analogy between the two because, if you ignore the mechanisms of actions, but they both do the same thing in terms of the human body stops becoming, a system that it wants to support and becomes a resource it wants to exploit. So yeah, and they of course do compete with each other. And I imagine it's possible to have multiple strains of the same virus actually potentially competing with itself within your own body. Like, you essentially become a battleground or an ecosystem for these viruses to compete for limited resources. Bit fucked up, but that's how she goes.
Well, another interesting discussion, and as usual, we delve into the macabre towards the end. Thanks again, guys, for coming along, and thank you, everybody, for listening in, and I hope to hear from you next time.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.